So the purpose of this presentation today is to give a very common sense explanation, I hope, of Part 7 benefits through ICBC and how they work. If the listener is looking for more detail, Murphy Battista has a guide to Part 7 benefits that's available in hard copy at our office or resource center or online. That will give you more detail on the regulations and how they function. This is more just a common sense approach. So the title today is ICBC Part 7 Benefits, How It Works. And these are the insurance coverage that almost every driver in BC has in the event that they're in an accident. So here our hypothetical is John Doe, and he's gotten into a car accident. And we're going to see how the Part 7 benefits help him in his recovery. So the first question after an accident, after you've made sure you're okay, is what claims do you have? There's really one question there. Is the accident somebody else's fault, or is it your own fault or nobody's fault? If it's somebody else's fault, then there will be a negligence claim, also called a tort claim, against the person whose fault the accident was. If the accident was your own fault or nobody's fault, then you still have the benefit of Part 7 benefits. Part 7 benefits are sometimes called no-fault benefits because they're there regardless of whether somebody else is at fault for the accident or not. So what should John do to make sure that he accesses the benefits that he's entitled to? First, he has to report the accident to ICBC, either himself or through a family member or through a lawyer. Within 30 days, he's got to provide written details of the accident and the injuries. And when you have to provide the written details of the accident and the injuries, oftentimes if you are the one injured and you are dealing with ICBC directly, they will try to get much more information than they're entitled to out of you. So it's important at that time, if you're dealing with ICBC directly, that you limit it to the details that ICBC needs to know, namely where the accident happened, the basics of how it happened, and the basics of the injuries that you suffered. If you have a lawyer at that point, they should be reporting the accident by giving the written notice on your behalf. And then within 90 days, he's got to complete what's called a CL22, or an accident benefits application form. That's a copy of that is on the next page there, and it just has basic information about who your doctor is, about the nature of the injuries, and as well about your employment, your income, and things of that nature. So for example, if John in this case has a neck injury that's limiting his ability to work or limiting his ability to live his daily life, what does he need to do? Well, the first thing he should do, regardless of whether or not there's an ICBC claim, presumably, is to speak to his family doctor or go to a walk-in clinic, and then find out what the doctor recommends. The Part 7 benefits come into play when the doctor generally recommends treatment that is going to have an out-of-pocket cost for John. There's two types of coverage under Part 7 for rehabilitation benefits. One is for mandatory benefits. Those are things that ICBC has to pay. That includes things like physiotherapy, massage therapy recommended by a doctor, the ambulance expense if there was one, prescription drug expenses. Those are all things that if your GP is saying that you need these for your recovery from the accident, ICBC is obligated to pay those. On the other hand, there are discretionary expenses, things like, for example, a pain management program that may be recommended for you, but it's up to your ICBC adjuster, essentially, whether or not they're going to fund that through Part 7. Then the question becomes, what of those expenses will ICBC pay? First of all, if John has another benefit provider, so for example, if he has coverage through work through Pacific Blue Cross or through Desjardins, that is what's called the first payer, and he needs to submit his claims first to his private medical insurer. If he doesn't have one, or if he's reached the limits of his coverage privately, then ICBC pays those expenses through Part 7. That said, there's the fine print in Part 7 coverage, just like any insurance policy, and they won't pay the full amount of those expenses in every case. Much of the time, they'll only pay what is deemed the MSP rate, and they'll consider the difference between that and the amount that's actually charged by the service provider as the user fee. And John, in that instance, may be out of pocket for the user fee. So, for example, if his physiotherapist charges $75 a session and the MSP rate is $50 a session, then he would be out of pocket the quote-unquote user fee of $25 for each session. Those costs, as well as any other costs that aren't covered in Part 7 but are a result of the accident, if he does have a negligence claim or a tort claim, can be recovered in that latter claim. How much coverage does John have? It is up to $150,000 worth of benefits. In the vast majority of cases, though, that is going to be more than enough, and he doesn't have to worry about that. Of course, in catastrophic cases or more serious injury cases or injury cases where it's going to be a permanent injury, the $150,000 will quickly be used up, and in those instances it's much more important to be careful in using your discretion about what exactly to spend those benefits on, particularly if there's not other coverage available. John may say to his ICBC adjuster that he needs more physiotherapy. He's gone for the first 12 sessions, but he's still hurting and he needs more. He might hear from his adjuster that ICBC has certain policies, for example, that they'll only fund the first 12 sessions. It's important to realize or to know that ICBC policies are not the law, and the corporation's obligations to pay depend on the regulations, the insurance vehicle regulations specifically, and not internal ICBC policies. So it's very common for us to be hearing from clients or people that have been injured in an accident having been told that ICBC said that they only pay a certain amount, and that's improper because it's the adjuster trying to tell the insured that there are certain limits on their coverage that don't really exist, and that's when you really need to make sure you push back properly. What if John can't properly take care of his home because he's injured? Well, there's also Homemaker Benefits that are available. If the injuries prevent him from regularly performing most of his household tasks, those can be accessed. Those can pay up to $145 a week for things like cooking and cleaning and laundry and general household tasks. But that has to be paid to a third-party provider. John can't pay his roommate or his spouse to do those tasks that he'd otherwise be doing. Now, what if he can't work? What if he's banged up from the accident and is unable to work? Part 7 also includes what are called total temporary disability benefits, what we refer to as TTD benefits. He'll be eligible for those if he was working at the time of the accident or if he worked for a minimum of 50% of the year before. Unfortunately, those are capped at $300 a week, and they're calculated based on 75% of the person's average earnings, generally speaking. What that means is that anybody who's earning roughly over $20,000 a year would have access to the maximum of $300 a week. Once again, though, this is secondary coverage. So if you've got private disability coverage, that is what's called the first payer. So for example, if John has coverage through Manulife in the event that he's unable to work, he has to make the application to Manulife, and he only accesses the TTD benefits if for some reason he can't access that. The TTD benefits can be used to top up private coverage. So for example, if he has coverage through Manulife that pays him 60% of his wages during disability, The TTD benefits can be used to top that up to 75% of his pre-accident earnings. The TTD benefits, importantly, don't form a part of the $150,000 cap on Part 7 benefits. So it's separate and apart from that cap for the rehab expenses. They're payable after a week, so you don't get any TTD benefits for the first week that you're off work. How long do they continue? If you're not able to do your own job, they're payable for up to 2 years. After 2 years, they transition to what's called any occupation benefits, and essentially it means that you have to be unable to do any reasonable alternative to your own job. If you're still unable to do any reasonable alternative, then they are payable to the age of 65. There are, again, exceptions to that. It's important that you also apply for employment insurance as well as CPP disability benefits. There are also, in tragic cases where somebody loses their life in an accident, death benefits payable. Those are very limited, somewhat shockingly so in some instances. It's up to a maximum of $2,500 for funeral expenses, and then there are survivor benefits that depend on who the amount of which depends on who the deceased was. What I've been talking about so far has been somewhat premised on injuries that aren't perhaps catastrophic or permanent. In those cases, as I mentioned before, you do need to be much more careful to maximize the effectiveness of benefits. Oftentimes when somebody's had a catastrophic injury, of course, their, for example, home is going to need to be modified. They're going to need to have a modified vehicle to continue to get around, all of which can be incredibly expensive. Part 7 benefits can be used to fund home renovations, but they can only be used to do that once. So for example, if after an accident you're not sure if you're going to be moving back into your old home or moving into a new home down the road, those decisions should typically be made before significant sums are spent on home renovations. Typically they can only be used for one modified vehicle as well. And of course, with the $150,000 cap on benefits, that will quickly be eaten up by home renovations and modified vehicles. So again, care needs to be taken. Of course, they can also be used for prosthetics as well. So what happens if ICBC gives John the runaround? If you are in a dispute with ICBC over whether or not a particular expense is reasonable, that can be taken to arbitration. If they're refusing to pay, then a lawsuit can be filed against ICBC. Typically, when there is a negligence claim, a Part 7 claim is filed simultaneously. The Part 7 claim, importantly, must be filed within 2 years of the date of the accident, or if they have been paying benefits after the accident, the date of the last payment. For most claims, the limitation date, the 2 years, doesn't run for children, anybody under 19 years of age, but for Part 7 benefits, it does. So you need to be careful when there are children involved to make sure that any limitation periods are met by filing a claim within 2 years of the accident. If you miss the deadline, you can lose your right to any benefits, and it can affect your negligence or tort claim as well. One thing that John might find happening if he's accessing Part 7 benefits is that ICBC will ask for him to attend a doctor that they've selected to do an assessment of him. This is supposed to be used to determine whether or not he's entitled to the Part 7 benefits he's claiming, and they do have the rights and the regulations to ask for such an assessment. Sometimes, though, they step over the line and use it more for their defense of the negligence claim rather than the Part 7 entitlement, and care needs to be taken to make sure that that's not what's happening. They can't insist that you take certain treatments, but they do have a right that if to deny benefits if their doctor thinks certain benefits would help John and he refuses to take them without good reason to do so. This is not, of course, meant to be a comprehensive presentation. As I believe Tom Waite said, the large print giveth and the small print taketh away. And as I said before, just like any insurance policy, there is small print that will affect your entitlement to benefits. If you aren't sure about it, if you aren't being treated fairly, and if you've been seriously injured in an accident, the best thing to do is to consult a lawyer to make sure that you are properly covered and that ICBC is living up to their obligations in paying you Part 7 benefits that you're entitled to. If you've got any further questions, you're welcome to give us a call, and our contact information is up there.